US President Donald Trump has massively expanded the trade war that he was previously waging largely against China, and he has imposed very high tariffs on many countries all around the world. Trump announced the sweeping new tariffs in a ceremony outside the White House on the 2nd of April, and Trump claimed that this was Liberation Day.
My fellow Americans, this is Liberation Day, waiting for a long time. April 2nd, 2025 will forever be remembered as the day American industry was reborn, the day America's destiny was reclaimed, and the day that we began to make America wealthy again.
Now, Trump loves tariffs. This isn't new. During his first term, Trump also imposed tariffs on China. He started a trade war against China in 2018. And during his presidential campaign in 2024, Trump repeatedly said that he loves tariffs so much that he thinks that the word tariff is the most beautiful word in the English language, more beautiful than love.
The word tariff is the most beautiful word in the dictionary, more beautiful than love, more beautiful than respect. No, less beautiful than religion, though, right? I don't want to get into that argument. But the word tariff is the most beautiful word in the dictionary. Remember that. It's going to make our country rich.
However, the tariffs that Trump is now imposing in his second term as U.S. president are much bigger than those he imposed in his first term and are going to have a huge impact not only on the U.S. economy, but on the global economy. Now, Trump claimed that these tariffs that he's imposing are so-called reciprocal tariffs, and the White House published a long list of countries showing what the new so-called reciprocal rate will be. At the ceremony, Trump even pulled out this comically large chart, and he named off countries like, for instance, China, which is going to face an additional 34% tariff plus the previous 20% tariff that Trump imposed, which means that the U.S. is now going to put a 54% tariff on all Chinese goods imported into the U.S. And the U.S. imports more goods from China than any other country. Trump also announced massive tariffs on other major trading partners of the U.S., like a 46% tariff on Vietnam, and the U.S. imports a lot of electronics, including cell phones and computers, from Vietnam, which means that the cost of those goods is going to massively increase. He likewise announced a 20% tariff on the European Union, a 24% tariff on Japan, a 25% tariff on South Korea, and high rates on many other major trading partners of the United States. Now, this is a crazy policy in numerous ways that I'll be discussing today. First of all, this is going to lead to high levels of inflation in the U.S. This is going to cause the price of goods to increase, which is deeply ironic because the reason that Donald Trump even won the 2024 presidential election in the first place is because there were high rates of inflation following the COVID pandemic. Incumbent parties and governments around the world lost power in elections. The Democrats were an example. Voters blamed Biden and Harris for the inflation, and Trump said he was going to bring down prices. But that's actually not even the craziest part of these tariffs that Trump is imposing. What's even crazier is that Trump has claimed that these are reciprocal tariffs, but the numbers that the White House is using are not the actual tariff rates charged by other countries. In other terms, it's a lie when Trump claims that these are reciprocal tariffs. This was pointed out on Twitter by the financial journalist James Surowiecki. He noted that in order to come to these numbers of the so-called reciprocal tariff rate, what the Trump White House actually did is they took the trade deficit that the U.S. has with each country and they divided it by the country's exports to the U.S. And then Trump said, well, I'm going to be kind, and instead of charging the exact rate, we'll charge half of that rate. So they multiplied that by 0.5. And what's so funny about this is that when this financial journalist pointed this out, The White House Deputy Press Secretary, Kush Desai, who works for Donald Trump, he tweeted, "No, we literally calculated tariff and non-tariff barriers." And he linked to the official statement on the website of the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, in which they explained how they calculated the so-called reciprocal tariffs. This paper said it would be very difficult to calculate the actual rate of tariffs and trade barriers that other countries have. So instead, as a proxy, they used the U.S. trade deficit with each country and determined what tariff level would be required to reduce the U.S. trade deficit with that country to zero. And in the formula that they wrote, they used Greek letters, which makes it look complicated, but it's actually not complicated at all. It's exports minus imports divided by, and then they use these Greek letters like epsilon, but it's by 0.5 times imports. So in other words, this journalist was right. The White House Deputy Press Secretary was wrong. This is not the actual tariff rate that countries are charging on the U.S. This is a formula that the White House created based on the trade deficit that the U.S. has with each country. If you map out the tariff rate according to this formula, you can see that the tariff rate imposed on every single country maps 100% to trend. This is not based on the tariffs those countries are actually charging. This is totally arbitrary based on the U.S. trade deficit with that country. So in other words, what this journalist pointed out on Twitter was correct. The deputy White House press secretary was wrong. The Trump White House doesn't even understand the formula that they published to determine their so-called reciprocal tariff rate, because it's not a reciprocal tariff rate. And using tariffs like this makes no sense, because Trump says, okay, we're going to put these tariffs on to bring our trade deficit with each country to zero. But if the U.S. wants to reduce its trade deficit with other countries, by definition, it has to export more to other countries. But other countries are also going to be imposing tariffs on the U.S., which means that other countries are not going to import goods from the U.S. because those U.S. goods will be even more expensive. The European Union has said very clearly that it's going to respond to Trump's tariffs with actual reciprocal tariffs. China has also said that it's going to respond to Trump's tariffs, which are now at 54%, because it's 34% plus the original 20%. China has said that it's going to respond also with actual reciprocal tariffs. And what's even funnier is that in this paper that the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative published to justify these so-called reciprocal tariffs that are not reciprocal, they cited an academic paper that talked about why international trade was good for U.S. consumers because it brought down the price of consumer goods substantially. That's the paper they quoted in their article arguing why the U.S. should impose tariffs on all these countries. I mean, it truly is amazing. The Trump administration doesn't understand what the impact will be of these tariffs, not only on the United States, but on countries all around the world. This is very likely going to lead to a recession, or at the very least, a significant economic slowdown and a lot of problems, including increasing inflation. And I want to add another very important point here, which is the role of the US dollar as the global reserve currency. Because if Donald Trump's goal with these tariffs is to reduce the trade deficit that the US has with the rest of the world, the US current account deficit, well, one of the best ways to do that would be to end the role of the US dollar as the global reserve currency. But Trump is doing the exact opposite of that. He is desperate to try to save the dominance of the US dollar, and he has threatened 100% tariffs on BRICS members and other countries around the world that try to de-dollarize and try to drop the use of the dollar in their international trade.
And we will keep the US dollar as the world's reserve currency, and it is currently under major siege. Many countries are leaving the dollar. They're not going to leave the dollar with me. I'll say, you leave the dollar. You're not doing business with the United States because we're going to put 100% tariff on your goods. BRICS was put there for a bad purpose. And most of those people they don't even want to talk about it now. They're afraid to talk about it because I told them if they want to play games with the dollar, then they're going to be hit with a 100% tariff the day they mention that they want to do it. And they will come back and say, we beg you not to do this. BRICS is dead since I mentioned that. BRICS died the minute I mentioned that.
Now, if Trump truly wants to reduce the U.S. trade deficit, this makes no sense whatsoever, because one of the main reasons for this massive U.S. trade deficit is because of the role that the U.S. plays in the global economy as essentially the banker of the world, as the printer of the global reserve currency. Because the inverse, by definition, by accounting, the inverse of the U.S. current account deficit, the trade deficit that the U.S. has with the rest of the world, is the U.S. capital account surplus. So what does that mean? It means that because the dollar is the global reserve currency, other countries around the world need to get access to dollars. How do they get those dollars? The U.S. has to run a trade deficit with other countries. Otherwise, they don't have the dollars they need for the dollar to be the global reserve currency. And then what happens is that people outside of the U.S. who get those dollars because they export products to the U.S. prints debt, and then it buys those products with the debt. Those dollars go to the foreign exporter. The exporter puts those dollars in its bank account, and then those dollars are used by investors in foreign countries to invest in U.S. assets. They buy U.S. stocks. They buy U.S. bonds, treasury securities. They buy U.S. real estate, and that causes the capital account to go into surplus. So there's all of this foreign finance capital that's constantly flowing into the United States, which is the inverse of its current account deficit. They're directly related. If you want to end the current account deficit, you also have to end the capital account surplus and vice versa. But Donald Trump doesn't understand any of this, which is why his policy makes no sense. Trump says he wants to reduce the U.S. current account deficit to zero, but then other countries won't have the dollars they need to keep using the dollar in international trade. But Trump says if they stop using the dollar in international trade, he's going to put tariffs on them. But then Trump also says if the other countries don't reduce their trade surplus with the U.S. to zero, he's also going to put tariffs on them. So what does he want? It makes no sense. The real way to reduce the U.S. trade deficit is to end the dollar system, is to move to a different kind of system like was originally proposed by John Maynard Keynes in the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, his system of a bond corps, which would be an international unit of account, and then its value would be based on a basket of different commodities or maybe different currencies. That would be an actual solution. But instead of that, Trump is threatening any country that de-dollarizes. He's threatening BRICS. His strategy makes no sense. It's totally contradictory. And back in January, when Trump first announced 25% tariffs on the two largest trading partners of the U.S., Mexico and Canada, the Wall Street Journal editorial board referred to this as, quote, the dumbest trade war in history, end quote. And this latest escalation of the U.S. trade war on the entire planet is even dumber. It makes no sense and is going to cause significant damage to the U.S. economy. And Trump and his supporters claim, well, the reason that they're doing this is because they want to reindustrialize the U.S. Now, I am on record for years now saying that the U.S. does need to reindustrialize, that deindustrialization has been a big problem in the U.S. But just imposing tariffs on the rest of the world is not going to magically reindustrialize the economy. Later, I'll talk more in detail about that, but this strategy is simply not going to work. Every single advanced economy that has industrialized in history has done so through a state-led developmental campaign using government investment in infrastructure, in education, in key manufacturing sectors, developing the human capital needed, investing in the actual capital equipment needed. And Trump is not doing any of that. He's imposing austerity and Reaganomics at the same time while he's putting on these tariffs and expecting that magically the free market will reindustrialize the U.S. after it was exactly this kind of free market neoliberal economics that led the U.S. economy to be deindustrialized in the first place. It's because the financial sector was deregulated under Ronald Reagan in the 1980s and then also Bill Clinton in the 1990s. This was bipartisan in the neoliberal era, and it was much more profitable for capitalists in the US to invest in the financial sector, not in manufacturing. Instead, they sent their factories abroad where they could exploit low-paid labor. They also wanted to break the back of unions in the US. And what happened? Instead of investing in manufacturing and in production, US corporations, they stopped investing and they spent much of their net income to buy back their own stock and to pay out dividends to push up their share prices, because in the same time, thanks to the Jack Welch model of CEOs and restructuring of corporations, we saw that the incentives of all of these corporate executives was to boost the price of their stocks. And still today, CEOs are paid huge bonuses if they increase the price of their stocks. So their incentive is not to actually increase production and to invest. And this is why in 2014, Bloomberg reported that 95% of the earnings of the top 500 publicly traded companies in the US in the S&P 500 stock market index, 95% of their earnings went to buying back their own shares and to paying out dividends to shareholders. This is why companies don't invest in actual production. It's not nearly as profitable. So until the US government fundamentally changes its policies toward the financial sector, it's not going to be profitable for companies to invest in manufacturing and local production. They're going to continue to invest in the most speculative areas of the economy, which are the financial sector, real estate. Private equity is a good example of this. The reason that private equity exists as an industry is precisely because companies don't want to create a new company. They don't want to create new factories. They want to buy up existing companies and then sell those companies for parts, asset strip them. That's the entire business model of private equity. In fact, instead of trying to solve those problems by massively taxing the rich, by taxing capital gains, instead of that, what is the Trump administration doing? The exact opposite. The Trump administration is cutting taxes on the rich. It's cutting taxes on corporations, and it's implementing austerity and slashing government spending on education and infrastructure and all of the other elements of an actual industrial policy that would be needed to reindustrialize the US. So this policy makes no sense. And then there's the fact that it's going to lead to higher rates of inflation. Even before Trump announced these massive new tariffs, consumer price inflation was already increasing in the United States, and now it's likely to increase much more. The University of Michigan does a survey every month that looks at inflation expectations in the US, and they have found that US businesses are expecting much higher rates of inflation. And what happens when US businesses expect inflations? They start hiking prices, which causes inflation. The University of Michigan survey has also shown a major increase in inflation expectations among US consumers. And what happens when consumers expect a lot of inflation in the future? They go out and buy the products now because they say, well, today the products will be cheaper than they will be in a few months. So I might as well just get the products now before the prices go up. So what happens? A bunch of consumers go out, buy products, demand looks like it's higher. And what happens? Businesses start raising prices. This is exactly what is happening as consumers expect more and more tariffs. And they're saying, wow, the price of cell phones and computers and TVs, the prices are going to go up a lot. So I'm going to go buy this now. They go and buy them. Businesses raise the prices and you get more inflation, which is exactly what is already happening before Trump even announced these massive tariffs on countries all around the world. And it's not just in consumer goods like cell phones and TVs and computers. It's also food. And this has been a huge problem, is food inflation in the US, with things like eggs, the prices of eggs going through the roof. Well, now food companies are saying that because of tariffs, they're going to significantly raise food prices, not only of imported food because of the tariffs, but the food that they produce domestically is also going to go up. And Trump's tariffs make no sense because they're blanket tariffs. They're not targeted at specific industries. Like, it would make sense if he said that he wants to help rebuild the US car industry. So he's focusing specifically on tariffs on foreign cars. He did announce that, but now he's announcing blanket tariffs on everything, including food. So look at example like coffee. The US National Coffee Association points out that coffee cannot be grown in the US. Only in Hawaii and Puerto Rico, which is a US colony, 99% of the coffee in the US is imported from other countries. The US imports its coffee from Brazil and Colombia and Vietnam and Honduras and other countries. And more than 70% of American adults drink coffee at least once per week. So Trump has now just increased the price of coffee for 70% of Americans. Or look at even more important foods like fruits and vegetables. The United States imports around 60% of all the fresh fruit sold in the country, and it imports about 40% of the fresh vegetables in the country. Trump has just massively increased the price of fruits and vegetables in the US. Because, okay, defenders of Trump would say, well, why don't we just produce more fruits and vegetables in the US? There are a lot of fruits and vegetables that cannot be produced in the US or only in certain states, like maybe Florida. How are you going to produce mangoes or bananas in Wisconsin? You're never going to be able to do it. Maybe in Florida and California, but the US imports a lot of these fruits and vegetables from other countries because the US can't produce them. And blanket tariffs will simply result in all of those foreign goods becoming much more expensive. I think people do not understand how much damage this is going to do to the US economy. Trump supporters really do not understand how reliant the US economy is on imports. If you look at the most recent data from the World Bank and the UN, which is from 2022, it shows that 17% of US imports come from China, 13.6% come from Mexico, 13.2% come from Canada, 4.6% come from Japan, 4.5% come from Germany, and 4% come from Vietnam. Trump has just imposed 53% tariffs on China, which is the largest exporter to the US, and he imposed 46% tariffs on Vietnam, which is the sixth largest exporter to the US. In 2024 alone, the United States imported $439 billion of goods just from China. So what exactly does the US import from China? Well, the number one item is cell phones and other phones, which are included under broadcasting equipment and also cameras. The second biggest is computers. The US also imports office machine parts, electrical transformers, electrical machinery, valves, electric batteries, electric heaters, toys, video games, seats, furniture, sweaters, clothes, many different kinds of textiles, plastic products and things like Tupperware, motor vehicle parts for cars, and many, many, many other products. Trump thinks he can just magically open factories to produce all of these products domestically. But you know how difficult it is? You know how many decades it will take to build these factories, to train workers to build all of these products that the US imports from China? You can't just magically import tariffs and then expect that you'll have a solution within one presidential term. This is going to take decades to do. The situation is the same with Vietnam. In 2024, the US imported $137 billion of goods from Vietnam, which has become a major producer of electronics. So what does the US import from Vietnam? Well, a lot of cell phones, a lot of computers, cameras, semiconductor devices, office machine parts, integrated circuits, insulated wire, electrical transformers, video displays, a lot of clothing and footwear, shoes, a lot of furniture, also rubber products and trunks and cases, iron products and other metal products. Again, The US is not going to be able to magically replace all of these goods and produce them locally. With what factories? With what workers? They have to train workers. They have to educate engineers. They have to physically build the factories. And who's going to build the factories? Who's going to invest? Where is the money going to come from? Is the US government going to actually invest in infrastructure that's needed to build all of these products, to make them domestically? The Trump administration does not have any other industrial policy. Its only magical solution is tariffs, and the free market will solve everything. That's not how industrial policy has worked in any country in history. These are the countries that the United States imports phones from. 28% of phones imports come from China. 7.5% come from Vietnam. 7% come from Malaysia. And the Trump administration just hit Malaysia with 24% tariffs. 5.25% of US imports of phones come from Thailand. And Trump just hit Thailand with 36% tariffs. Or let's look at computers. The United States gets 40.7% of its computer imports from China, and Trump just put 54% tariffs on China. The US also imports 15% of computers from Taiwan, which is known as Chinese Taipei in UN and in World Bank data, because according to international law, Taiwan is part of China. And in the data from these international law-based institutions, they refer to Taiwan as Chinese Taipei. So 15% of US phones imports come from Taiwan. And Trump also just put a 32% tariff on Taiwan. The US also gets 9.4% of its phone imports from Vietnam, and there is now a tariff rate of 46% on Vietnam. Let's look at electric batteries, which are needed for everything in the 21st century. Our phones, our computers, everything have batteries. 51.8% of batteries imported into the US come from China. 51.8%, over half. Another 16.6% come from South Korea. And Trump just put 25% tariffs on South Korea. Another 6.5% of US battery imports come from Japan. And Trump hit Japan with a 24% tariff rate. And an additional 5.4% of US imports of batteries come from Mexico. And Trump is putting 25% tariffs on Mexico. So what are Donald Trump's plans to actually produce cell phones, computers, and batteries in the US? Is the US government going to invest significantly in infrastructure? Is it going to invest in training workers to actually make these products domestically? No. The Trump administration does not have any actual industrial policy other than tariffs, and the free market will magically solve everything. Now, I was very critical of the Joe Biden administration, and there are infinitely many things you could criticize Biden and the Democrats for, especially the crimes against humanity that they committed in Gaza. Biden should be tried for crimes against humanity and war crimes. If the ICC were, the International Criminal Court, were a true non-biased institution, Biden and other US presidents, along with Trump, would be facing charges there at The Hague. But regardless, despite all of the infinitely many valid criticisms of the Biden administration, one of the things that Biden at least tried to do was to have a real industrial policy. The Biden administration passed two major pieces of legislation known as the funnily named Inflation Reduction Act, which is not really about inflation, the so-called IRA, which is also hilariously named. But anyway, the IRA was aimed at re-industrializing the US, but focusing on certain strategic sectors, especially in renewable energy, things like electric vehicles and batteries and solar panels and wind turbines. And also the Biden administration passed the CHIPS Act, which was a US government program to develop a local chips industry for semiconductors. And because of these US government incentives, including subsidies and tax breaks and infrastructure investment, there was genuinely a big increase in manufacturing production in the US in some of these areas. So despite the many valid criticisms of Biden, this was at least a legitimate attempt at trying to have an industrial policy. Trump, what is he doing? He's getting rid of all of these policies. He's going against the actual industrial policy, tearing it all up, imposing austerity, And Trump thinks that simply by imposing tariffs, other companies will come invest in the US and open factories. Well, they're not going to do that for a variety of reasons. First of all, it's very risky and it's not very profitable. And that's why, again, a lot of companies would simply prefer to put their money into financial speculation, not intangible production. But furthermore, when the Biden administration tried to offer incentives and big tax breaks and subsidies worth billions of dollars to companies to manufacture chips, semiconductors locally, you know what happened? TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, they opened up factories in Arizona, but they found that there were no workers. They didn't have the skilled workers in the US who knew how to actually manufacture these chips. In addition to the billions of dollars and the years that it will take to build these factories and to create the infrastructure, it will also take years to train the workers they need to work in these very advanced factories that include a lot of automation and robots. It's very complicated. You can't just bring someone and immediately teach them how to make semiconductors. So what was the solution to this problem? TSMC sent their workers from Taiwan to Arizona. 50% of the employees in these factories in Arizona are from Taiwan. But then Trump says he wants to crack down on immigration and he wants these jobs to go to Americans. But you can't just magically reindustrialize. The US has been deindustrializing over decades since the financialization of the economy and the rise of neoliberalism. You have lost generations of workers who had the skills needed to work in these factories. So if the US government wants to reindustrialize, the US government needs to invest a lot of money in education and in training workers. But instead of doing that, Donald Trump is doing the exact opposite. Donald Trump in March signed an executive order to dismantle the US Department of Education at a time when large numbers of Americans have trouble reading at an adult level. They read it at the level of children. A lot of Americans understand mathematics and science at the level of an elementary school student, and Trump is busy dismantling the education department. You know, one of the main reasons why China has become the world's manufacturing superpower, it's because the Chinese government has prioritized industrial upgrading and has made plans. The Communist Party of China every 5 years publishes a new 5-year plan. And if you read the 5-year plan, at the heart of it is industrial upgrading. In 2015, China announced the Made in China 2025 initiative, and they said, we're going to target these sectors, we're going to massively invest in these sectors, provide government support in order to develop a semiconductor industry, electric vehicles, batteries, solar panels, and China has succeeded. And in a conservative estimate, China spends 1.73% of GDP on industrial policy, in subsidies, and cheap loans from state-owned banks, in infrastructure investment, in worker training, in order to develop these advanced industries. And here we see the Trump administration saying it wants to reindustrialize, but imposing austerity. I know I keep repeating myself, but this literally makes no sense. It's the exact opposite of an industrial policy. So what this all leads me to wonder is if the Trump administration, not just Trump himself, but his advisors, the people around him, not everyone in the Trump administration is stupid, although there clearly are a lot of very dumb people. But what I keep asking myself is, do they really think that they can actually reindustrialize the US with this strategy? Or are they trying to do something different? And maybe this is not actually about reindustrializing the US. What this is really about is shifting the tax burden permanently off of capital, off of the rich, off of corporations, and onto workers, onto poor Americans. And the more I think about it, the more I see what they're doing, I think this is the real goal of what the Trump administration is doing. They say they're going to reindustrialize, but in reality, Trump has said several times, he said it publicly, that he wants to replace the income tax and certainly capital gains tax with tariffs, which is a very regressive tax. Now, the US tax system is already very regressive in practice. On paper, it's supposedly progressive, but thanks to Trump's tax cuts on the rich during his first administration, as of 2018, billionaire families in the US pay a lower tax rate than the bottom half of Americans, of poor and working class Americans. So this is already, in practice, a very regressive tax system. But economists have shown that according to Trump's proposal for his second term, which he's in now, what he's going to be doing is massively increasing taxes on poor and working class Americans in the form of tariffs. And Trump claims that by imposing tariffs on countries around the world, that will help make up for the revenue, the government revenue that's lost by the tax cuts on the rich. Because Trump has pledged to continue cutting taxes on the rich and to cut taxes on corporations, and this is going to benefit only around 5% of the population, a small handful of elites who are going to see their taxes reduced by $36,000 in terms of the richest 1%. But then the bottom 95% of Americans, the vast majority, will have their taxes increased in the form of tariffs. And honestly, I think this is the real goal of Trump's tariffs. It's not actually reindustrialization. It's moving the burden of taxation onto poor and working people, and the rich can continue to do whatever they want and buy up companies. Private equity will boom. The stock market will probably go back to booming after this temporary crash that we're seeing and this crisis in the stock market because of the tariffs. In a year or two, we'll see what happens. But I think this is the Trump administration's real goal. And they say that they're going to help people through reindustrialization and they're going to bring back jobs to the Rust Belt. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they are stupid and they think this is going to work. But actually, I think this just could be all a cynical maneuver. And they know it's not going to reindustrialize the U.S. But they also know that they can cut taxes on the rich and make up for some of that loss by increasing taxes effectively on the vast majority of poor and working people in the U.S. That's frankly the conclusion that I'm increasingly coming to here. Maybe I'm wrong. We'll see what happens. It's very hard to predict what Trump will do because by nature, he pursues this kind of madman theory where he tries to scare everyone and says one thing and does another. So we'll see what happens. I mean, it's very possible that he could suddenly do a 180 and then say that he's going to lift all of these tariffs that he's announced on countries around the world. It's impossible to predict what Trump will do, but based on the evidence, it seems to me that this is all part of a strategy of moving the tax burden off of the rich and putting it on the poor and the working class. And tariffs are just an excuse for doing that. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton. I'm the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I will see you all next time.